Let's start from Somalia, where 4 al-Shabaab militants have been killed by U.S. airstrikes. In a statement, the U.S. Africa Command said it carried out 3 airstrikes in the vicinity of Khunyabaro and Kaliobaro. It said the raids were carried out with the Somali government to target militants who had attacked innocent civilians. The strikes came after a truck bombing in Mogadishu killed at least 80 people. U.S. strikes in Somalia surged after President Donald Trump declared the country's south an area of active hostilities. Well, the U.S. military says it has also carried out defensive strikes in Iraq and Syria against an Iran-backed militia. In a statement, the Pentagon said the airstrikes targeted 5 locations, including weapons depots and command and control centers. It said the strikes were conducted in response to the killing of a U.S. contractor in a rocket attack on an Iraqi military base in Kirkuk. A U.S. official said the strikes will limit the group's ability to carry out future attacks on Americans and their Iraqi government allies. The Defense Department gave no details, though, immediately on how the strikes were conducted. Meanwhile, in Iraq, hundreds of demonstrators have taken to the streets of Baghdad and Najaf to protest the nomination of Asad al-Aidani for prime minister. Students marched alongside protesters calling for the betterment of the country's economy and public services. Protesters have demanded an overhaul of the corrupt political system, which they say keeps citizens in poverty. Earlier, demonstrators broke into the Nasiriyah oil field and forced employees in the control room to cut off the field's power supply. President Barham Saleh has already refused to accept the nomination of Asad al-Aidani as prime minister. More than 450 people have been killed since a wave of civil unrest began on October 1st. Let's move on now to Kuwait, which says it does respect Iran's territorial integrity, a day after Tehran summoned its envoy to lodge a protest. In a meeting with Iran's ambassador, Mohammad Irani, Kuwait's deputy foreign minister, Khalid al-Jarallah, stressed that his country's foreign policy is based on respecting sovereignty. State media said the deputy foreign minister assured the Iranian envoy of non-interference in Tehran's internal affairs. Earlier, Iran said that it summoned Kuwait's envoy to protest against a meeting of its officials with a separatist group. Jarallah told Iran's ambassador that the meeting took place without permission from relevant Kuwaiti authorities. He said officials have begun taking necessary legal measures over the affair, which was undertaken in a private capacity. Israel, meanwhile, has decided to withhold $43 million in tax handovers to Palestine. Tel Aviv claims Palestinians have used the funds to support families of slain or wounded militants. The total amount of money withheld now equals 7% of tax funds due to the Palestinian Authority. Palestinians say the payments are needed to help vulnerable families affected by violence and the Israeli occupation. Under interim peace deals, Israel collects taxes on behalf of Palestinians. With diplomacy stalled since 2014, Israel has at times withheld money as a measure of protest or pressure. Countrywide protests against the controversial citizenship law are continuing in India. The West Bengal Chief Minister, Mamata Banerjee, will lead a protest march against the act today in the Purulia district. The all-women sit-in against the act is still ongoing in New Delhi. Meanwhile, the Bharatiya Janata Party Minister Ramesh Pokhriyal has threatened students who take part in protests. The minister said the government will not tolerate it. Foreign diplomats in India have also expressed concern and unease over the Modi government's controversial Citizenship Act. Speaking to media, the envoy said recent events suggest New Delhi is intolerant of criticism and dissent. Diplomats say New Delhi has not briefed them on the law. They said the bill and police crackdown on protesters have made their countries question India's commitment to shared values. Earlier, the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe and Bangladesh's foreign and home ministers cancelled trips to India because of the unrest. 27 people have been killed across the country in protests against the new act, which is seen as anti-Muslim. Elsewhere, North Korea has called for positive and offensive measures to safeguard the country's sovereignty and security ahead of a year-end deadline for talks with the U.S. State media says leader Kim Jong-un suggested action in foreign affairs, the defense industry, and the armed forces. Kim led a weekend meeting of senior Workers' Party officials to discuss policy during rising regional tensions. State media said the leader also discussed state management and economic issues. It said he called for the grave state of industrial sectors of the national economy to be urgently corrected. Earlier, U.S. National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien said the situation in North Korea is dangerous and causes concern. Russia's President Vladimir Putin, meanwhile, has thanked his U.S. counterpart Donald Trump for intelligence that helped foil attacks on Russian soil. The Kremlin said Putin held a telephone conversation with Trump. It said both leaders agreed to continue bilateral cooperation in order to tackle terrorism. Earlier, Russia's intelligence agency said it arrested 2 people suspected of planning an attack in St. Petersburg. It said they appeared to have been preparing a terrorist act during the New Year's festivities. Spain's Coast Guard has picked up a boat carrying 52 African migrants in the Atlantic Ocean. The Red Cross says the rescued migrants have been transported to the port of Arguineguín on the islands of Gran Canaria. The international humanitarian movement said all the migrants were male, including minors. Thousands of migrants from Africa and the Middle East regularly embark on the dangerous journey by sea to make it to Europe. In a report, Spain's Ministry of Interior said over 24,000 irregular migrants, have arrived in the country by sea this year alone. Greece has said if talks with Turkey on a maritime dispute fail, it will take the matter to the International Court of Justice. Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis says he will discuss the dispute on a political and diplomatic level. Earlier, Cyprus petitioned the ICJ to safeguard its offshore mineral rights. Ankara signed a maritime accord with Tripoli last month that seeks to create an exclusive economic zone from Turkey's southern shore to Libya's northeast coast. Greece and Cyprus say the deal is void and violates international law. Well, in Mexico, 11 people have been killed and 7 others injured after a car collided with a van carrying tourists in the southeastern state of Chiapas. Officials say the accident happened when the car crossed to the opposite lane and crashed into the bus on a busy highway. They said the bus was traveling from the border town of Tapachula. It was carrying a family on their way to the mountain town of San Cristobal de las Casas for a vacation. In the U.S., a man has shot dead 2 people during a church service in Texas before being killed by an armed member of the congregation. Officials say another parishioner is in critical condition. Health officials say 1 person died at the crime scene and 1 on their way to the hospital. Police said they are still trying to determine the attacker's motives. The shooting was captured on video because the service was being live streamed. The UN says millions of children across the world are entering a new decade having faced the devastating consequences of violence in conflict zones. The United Nations Children's Agency said it has documented 170,000 violations against minors since 2010. It said the violations include killing, maiming, abduction, sexual abuse, and recruitment into armed groups. UNICEF Executive Director Henrietta Fore said the attacks on children and young people continue unabated, with combatants ignoring the basic laws of war. And coming up next in this news bulletin, icebergs have become a source of income on Canada's east coast. And Antarctica is a new frontier for eco-curious tourists. Thanks for staying with us. Now, Facebook has blocked the live stream of Pakistan Broadcasting Corporation for highlighting human rights abuses in occupied Kashmir. The valley has been under an Indian-imposed clampdown for the last 148 days. State media said the social media platform alleged the transmission violated its community standards. The Pakistani government and media have been raising their voices for the occupied valley at all platforms, including the UN, the EU, and the OIC. Well, in Brazil, a conflict is brewing between indigenous peoples and settlers hoping to make a living off the land. The government wants to expand agriculture and mining, but the forest, is in the way. Details in this report.
A trail of chopped-down trees cuts through the protected indigenous land. The site is familiar by now to Tachi, a chief of the Arara people in the northern Brazilian Amazon.
It's sad when you see the trees lying on the ground like that. That piece of wood is already dead.
Criminals strike easily from the nearby Trans-Amazonian highway. But after President Jair Bolsonaro's election in October, the logging only picked up. Frustrated and defiant, Tachi and his warriors resort to extreme measures. Bit by bit, they eat the forest smaller, sometimes killing those who stand in their way. Leaders from the Arara and other tribes hit out at the invasions in a recent meeting with a senior cabinet minister.
I am a chief. I will die if you kill my land, but I will fight for my people.
Invaders feel emboldened by the new far-right president's talk, the leaders said. Bolsonaro spurns indigenous people's culture and a right to land they won after centuries of oppression. But his emissary, General Carlos Santos Cruz, said the government is not encouraging crime.
That is absurd. The invasion of any land, the occupation of any area, indigenous or not, or private, is criminal.
Deforestation levels reached a decade high in Brazil last year. But the forest protection is a life and death struggle, especially for activists. Brazil has one of the world's highest rates of murder in land conflicts.
In Newfoundland, Canada, businessmen are cashing in on icebergs as more and more ice giants from Greenland drift to the island. Some see it as a boon, others as a stark illustration of the accelerated melting of the Arctic. More about the melting ice now in this report.
Every summer in Newfoundland, Edward Keane goes hunting for icebergs. Keane and his crew collect ice blocks that have floated down thousands of miles from Greenland's glaciers, a sight that's becoming more common as temperatures rise.
They're going to die in a couple, 3 weeks and naturally be gone back to nature anyway. So we're not here hurting the environment.
But this is no scientific mission. There's profit to be had. The water from the glaciers of the Arctic is renowned for its purity because it was frozen long before the air pollution of the Industrial Revolution. Over 2 months, Keane and his crew can recover about 800,000 litres of iceberg water, which they sell to traders at $1 a litre. Villagers along the ice path see it as a welcome financial windfall. While some are enjoying the consequences of climate change, others are concerned.
It's a concrete image of global warming to see icebergs coming to places where the waters are so warm. It's true that it makes you wonder.
And the Arctic is warming 3 times faster than the rest of the world. But for these coastal communities, the icebergs that venture down from Greenland could be floating white nights.
Once reserved for only fearless adventurers, Antarctica is now just a click away for an increasing number of curious tourists. But the growing trend is increasing the threat of climate change on a continent already suffering the effects of global warming. This report describes why.
430 tourists aboard, mostly from the UK, Germany and the United States, have just seen their first iceberg and caught a glimpse of Antarctica's contours. Before each stop on Antarctica, a dedicated team prepares the terrain. Comfort is a priority, but here the passengers are explorers, not clients. Before going ashore, passengers must clean their boots and vacuum their clothes. Taking food and getting too close to the animals is also forbidden. These rules aim to limit man's impact on the region's already fragile ecosystem.
We understand even more when we come here. When we see the reality, when we feel it, how important it is that it stays that way.
With 14 million square kilometres of ice, Antarctica holds 90% of the world's freshwater reserves, but remains prey to global warming. Despite intentions being perceived as good, cruise ship companies and their clients have created a paradox. On average, each tourist produces 5 tonnes of CO2 emissions on their way to the South Pole.
We do it because we want to see it, and we do it as responsibly as we can. But it's not going to stop us.
For the 2019-2020 season, 78,000 passengers are expected to come to Antarctica.
Stock markets in Asia are trading mixed on the year's last full trading day for several major regional markets. Investors are consolidating recent gains amid optimism over the easing of trade tensions between the U.S. and China. The Shanghai Composite is trading 1% higher. China's central bank decided to use the loan prime rate as a new benchmark to price current floating rate loans to boost growth. Tokyo's Nikkei 225 has lost over 0.5% amid weak economic indicators. Hong Kong's Hang Seng has gained nearly 0.5% ahead of trade data for November, to be released later in the day. Seoul's Kospi is trading fractionally lower after pairing earlier gains. International oil prices are trading fractionally higher amid a greater than expected decline in United States crude oil inventories. Time to find out what the weather is like around the world. And with that, you're all caught up. Thank you for watching this news bulletin. You're on Indus News.